Looks like we're good to go. All right, so let's get started here. So let's just start with some introductions about who you are and maybe a little bit about where you're from.
Okay, well, my name is Bill Kunkle. Grew up in the Lehighton area. Went to high school here. Went to Kutztown State College, as it was known at that time, and got my teaching degree there. And ended up teaching in Whitehall for 35 years. Um, so yeah, it's a little bit about me. I've always loved the outdoors and sports and all that kind of thing. So being able to travel eventually worked in real nicely with my interests.
Yeah, that's awesome. I graduated from Kutztown too in 2020, so I guess
Yeah, by that time it was a university though.
yep, university now.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess let's jump right in. How about the you talked about a Lewis and Clark trip in 2004. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that and some of the things that you did on it.
Okay. Well, that was kind of interesting the way that one came about. 2004 was actually the 200th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and I knew that I'd be retiring in 2009, and I was trying to decide, how am I going to be able to supplement my income a little bit and still be able to have and be in touch with kids and that kind of thing and do something educationally. So I decided I'd like to do a trip on the Lewis and Clark Trail, so to speak, and learn as much as I could about it and maybe put together a program that I could do in elementary schools and middle schools. Unfortunately, by the time I did retire, things were changing quite a bit in education, and they were no longer spending money to have people come in and do special programs like that. So I never really got to do that part, but that's how the whole idea started. And I read about 8 books before I did the trip. The best one being one called Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. That was by far the best of all the ones that I read. Anyway, after doing that, did a lot of planning. I got a hold of some gazetteers for the various states that we'd be traveling through. I really didn't have good GPS capability. I had no cell phone at that time. I was a real dinosaur when it came to cell phones. I didn't get one until after I actually retired from teaching. So I didn't have a cell phone, and it wouldn't have mattered a whole lot in some places out west because there's really not, at least at that time, there wasn't good service in a lot of places anyway, I don't think. So anyway, did that a lot of that. Contacted visitor centers, some state parks, land management agencies, and things like that. I took a bike along because I knew I'd be getting onto some roads that were pretty remote. And I thought, gee, if I break down, I'm going to have some way to get back to some place to get some help if need be. My dad went along. I was actually going to do the trip by myself at first. And then my dad said, you know what, I'd like to go along with you. So I welcomed that opportunity. That was kind of neat. And as I was taking all these pictures on the trip, my dad actually recorded every picture that I took.
Oh wow.
Which was kind of important because I needed to be able to have information when I was putting the program together. So he recorded every picture. That was a great help. I kept a diary, just like Lewis and Clark had done on the original expedition, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later, I'm thinking. And one thing I did too, I made sure that I eventually got a hold of a bow saw and an axe because we were going to be traveling on some Forest Service roads, which I had read could end up being impassable if a tree fell down.
Oh
So
wow.
you had to have some way of, getting through, so to speak. So I did a lot of preparation for it, and it turned out to be a really fun trip, actually.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, it's just cool because I really like history too. So it's kind of cool to have something that connects the outdoors and history together to do a trip, like a commemoration of like a really historic event.
Oh, absolutely. And, again, I was originally going to be taking my pop-up camper to do the trip, But then when my dad said about going along, he said, I'd rather stay in motels, be a lot more comfortable for him. And I said, okay. He said, I'll pay for the motels, you pay for the gas. So that's what we ended up doing. By the way, I just checked. I had kept, like I said, a diary, and I ended up writing all of this into a book about what we did. I'm not a book to be published, but my own, something for my own use, an album for my own use. And I just looked back after being contacted to do this. I looked back at some of the things, and it's interesting to note that in 2004 we paid anywhere between $1.70 and $2.06 for a gallon of gas on the trip.
It's a big difference.
Yeah, things have changed quite a bit. And I think the motels we stayed in were oftentimes somewhere between about $45 and $60 a night, and that was it.
Yeah. Those were probably not the big chain motels too, like independent ones, I would think back then, maybe.
Uh, Actually, some of them were Best Westerns.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, some of them were Best Westerns, and then some of them were more independent type things, and those were actually some of the nicest ones, believe
Oh
it or
yeah.
not,
Yeah, I know.
and and the cheapest.
And you kind of get that hospitality too, because you know the owners of them, and they'll come out and they'll talk to you. Because I know when I've gone up to I think Vermont, like you go to a motel there that's owned by, it's just a family run business, and you can meet the owners, and they know all about the area and everything, so you get to
Oh
learn from
yeah.
them too. Yeah. Yeah. So with the Lewis and Clark trip, I guess I'm not. You may have touched on it a little bit. What was the preparation like to try and get things like put together to actually do the trip?
Well, basically, it was a matter of getting together the things that I had mentioned, the gazetteers. I actually made a calendar of destinations and so forth. I really planned it out quite well. So I took a lot of time doing that, along with reading all those books, and that's what helped me put that whole thing together. You know, by reading all the books, I pretty much had a good idea where I wanted to go, how much time I wanted to spend in various places, and it just turned out to be a really neat trip till it was all said and done. Um, the the interesting thing was we when you talk about that particular trip, I'd say the thing that was most interesting about it was the people that we met. Um, we met up with a guy in Brownville, Tennessee, if I remember, or not Tennessee, I'm sorry, Nebraska, Brownville, Nebraska, and his name was Tom Hecker. Um, he was a little bit older than I was, well, easily older than I was. I think he was probably in his early 70s, maybe at the time, and he was following the Lewis and Clark Trail pretty much the way they had done it. He was going up the Missouri River. He was on his third boat. The Missouri River is pretty treacherous, and he ended up finally, upon the recommendation of some local people who were used to being on the river, said, you know, this is the kind of boat you really need to get. So he was on his third boat, and he had stopped in this little town called Brownville, and the whole town came out, and they basically had a huge picnic for him while he was camped out there, which was kind of cool. Those are the kind of things that happen across America, you know.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So that was neat. And then I met, I should say, we stopped at a visitor center in North Dakota. I'm sorry, South Dakota. Chamberlain, I believe, was the name of the town that was close by. And it was late in the evening. I was doing a lot of photography. That's the other thing I did. I bought a lot of slide film. This was before I had a digital camera. So all the pictures I were taking were slides. So I had to be a little careful with, you know, what pictures I did select to take and all that kind of thing. Anyway, I'm the last person behind the visitor center, and I'm trying to take pictures of the sunset over the Missouri River. And all of a sudden, I see this guy coming up from behind me, and he's carrying an army knapsack. And he walks up to me. He said, "Do you mind if I sit down with you?" And he seemed a little nervous about something. And I said, "No, come on. I'm just taking some pictures here." He was young, and he began to tell me how he had just come back from Iraq, and he had been into Crete. And he said, if it would have been for our sergeant, we we would have all been killed. He said there were 9 of us, and he really knew what to do, and he got us out of this situation. And he said, I'm really a changed person after having all these experiences over there and everything. He said, and right now I'm on my way to visit one of my friends from over there, somebody that I was in the Army with, and he lives in Washington State. But, and I thought that's why he seemed a little nervous when he was telling me about this experience, because they had almost died over there, these guys. Well, then all of a sudden I found out why he was nervous. He says to me, is there a way to get across the river down there? I said, yeah, you can't see it, but there's a bridge right across the interstate there. Oh, he said, good. He said, I don't want to be on this side of the river. I just ran into a mountain lion about a half mile back, and I'm sleeping out at night on the ground, and I just don't want to be on this side of the river. So I ended up, I said, come on, I'll give you a ride over there. I gave him some trail mix, a big bag of trail mix that I hadn't opened yet, and wished him well. So that was kind of neat to meet him. His name was Lonnie Bighead. He joked about how, and his both parents were full-blooded Indians, and he joked about how would you like to go to school with a name like Lonnie Bighead? He said, I took a lot of teasing. So those were 2 very interesting people. And then another interesting thing that happened, we pulled into, and you're going to find this one quite a coincidence. We pulled into a motel in the small town of Whitehall, Montana. And I happened to have on a T-shirt from when we used to play the student faculty basketball game at the middle school, and it said Whitehall Zephyrs on it. Okay. So we go in to register, and there's a young girl working at the motel there, and she said, oh, I love your T-shirt, right? And I said, oh, I taught at this school. We were the Whitehall Zephyrs. She said, well, we're the Whitehall Trojans. And I said, well, that's interesting. I said, our neighboring district is the Parkland Trojans. And I said, they were a big, big adversary of ours, if you want to think of it that way. And she said, well, I really like that T-shirt. It had on the owl. I don't know if you remember seeing anything with the owl from Whitehall.
A little bit.
Yeah, that was kind of the insignia for the middle school. And she said, I really like that. I said, well, would you like to have it? And she got all excited. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll go back to our room. I'll take it off and I'll bring it right back up to you. But I said, you're going to have to wash it. I've had it on all day. So I ended up giving her a Whitehall Zephyrs T-shirt, and she thought that was pretty cool. And then, of course, the other thing that was neat about that trip, I got to visit my cousin and her husband, who had moved from the Lehighton area out to Washington State. They actually had moved to Oregon originally, but they were out there for quite a few years, and I had never gotten to go out and see them. So we combined this trip with a chance to go and visit them as well. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you get to, I think those kind of journeys and trips, you get to just meet all these people that you would never meet just kind of staying where you are, and you're like, there's so many different kind of cultures and things out there you can see and engage with, that it's hard to do just staying in one place.
Oh, for sure. And we discovered so much of that being the case when we were full-time RVers, which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later on, most likely. One other thing I wanted to share with you is the interesting things, and what we tried to do on this trip was we tried to hit some of the places that I had read about in terms of the Corps Discovery, which was the group that Lewis and Clark had put together, so to speak. We tried to hit some of the places where some of these events had happened that I had read about. And I wanted to get pictures without signs of modern things in them. I didn't want to have any vehicles parked at a place, or I didn't want to have any railroad tracks in there, because there were no railroad tracks at the time that Lewis and Clark went out there and that kind of thing. So I worked really hard to get the right kind of pictures. But anyway, we got to these places where all these different things had happened, which was kind of cool. And when Lewis and Clark started this, first of all, Thomas Jefferson was, and I'll do a little bit of history here if you don't mind, yeah, okay? Because I guess it's the teacher in me. Anyway, Thomas Jefferson was the president of the United States. It was 1803. and France really was hurting for money because of the wars that they had been battling in and that kind of thing. And they had owned all that Louisiana territory there, which was quite a bit. And we were able to purchase, Jefferson was able to make a deal and purchase all this acreage for like $15 million. It came out to less than 4 cents an acre.
Yeah.
Now
Wow.
that, when you think about that,
Yeah, absolutely.
it's pretty cheap for land, 4 cents an acre. And then, of course, he decided he needed to send somebody out there to discover what was there. And Lewis and Clark assembled 41 men altogether, including themselves. And the youngest one was a guy named George Shannon. He was only 19 years old at the time that they went on this trip. And he ended up getting, I actually, when I put the program together, and I did it at our school and I did it in some other places as well. But I would dress up and pretend that I was George Shannon. It's a little bit of a tough sell with my gray hair to be 19 years old, and that kind of thing. But anyway, it was fun. And George Shannon, he had an interesting experience. They sent him out one night to try to find some horses that had run off. And he was gone for 16 days. He got lost. He never did find the horses, as I recall. He got lost. The only thing he had to eat for 16 days were wild grapes that he was finding along the river. And he also he ran out of ammunition. He had powder, but he had no more bullets. And he ended up with his knife fashioning a stick that he put up the barrel of his gun, and he was able to shoot a rabbit.
Oh,
So
wow.
he did have one rabbit to eat. That was the only meat he had in 16 days. And then he finally got back and was able to rejoin the group. He got lost one other time too. He got lost, but only for 4 days this time. He was out hunting meat and got himself lost again. So he had a penchant for getting lost, that guy, I guess. So, there were a lot of interesting things that happened along the way in this trip. There was other people, and by the way, I called this program the Misadventures of Lewis and Clark. Instead of the adventures, I called it the Misadventures. And I would tell the kids about all the goofy things that happened. History is a whole lot more interesting than we are able to make it in school, to be
Right.
honest with you. We can only touch on things a little bit. Teachers don't get to delve into these things the way I was able to do for this trip. So some of the things I'll share with you. Clark had a slave named York who went along with him. And York was an interesting addition to the Corps of Discovery. The Arikara Indians especially were fascinated with him. They had never seen a black man before. And they tried to rub his skin off. They thought this was dirt.
Right.
So they were rubbing his skin, trying to rub the black off of him. Well, of course, that didn't work. But he was pretty big man and very strong. And he ended up being a pretty good asset because the tribes, were kind of fascinated with him and kind of didn't want to do harm to him, and that kind of thing. So that was kind of interesting. And then, of course, we all know about Sacagawea. That's how we were always taught to pronounce it. We think now it was actually pronounced Sacagawea.
Oh, interesting.
That's what our thinking is. And she had been taken by another tribe. The Indians did this a lot. The tribes would steal other tribes' children, their horses, their wives, whatever the case may be. And she was like only 8 years old when she was taken from her tribe, the Shoshones. And she ended up with this French fur trapper, Toussaint Charbonneau, taking her for his wife. And the group hired Charbonneau as an interpreter. They needed somebody who could speak French at that point, so they hired him as an interpreter. And Sacagawea was about 16 at the time. They were at Fort Mandan for the winter, and she was about to have a baby. And Lewis was the only person in the group who had any training in terms of doctoring type skills. He wasn't a doctor, but he had been trained by a guy by the name of Benjamin Rush, who was a pretty well-known doctor from the Philadelphia area at that time. So he was doing his best to try to get her to deliver this baby. And it was getting to the point where it was getting dangerous for Sacagawea, only being 16 and not being able to deliver this baby. And one of the Mandan Indians finally said, look, you know, and this was all difficult, the communication, because they had to go through interpreters to get all this. But he finally basically convinced Lewis, look, if you crush up these rattles from a rattlesnake and put them in some water and make a little potion and have her drink it, she'll be able to have this baby. And Lewis finally said, well, nothing else is working. Let's try it. He did it, and within 10 minutes, she had the baby.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of cool. So I learned all about these really cool things that happen, which we just don't get to talk about in history classes, you know.
Right.
And there was a lot of other things too. Actually, Lewis had bought a dog in Pittsburgh for $20. It was a Newfoundland dog, and he named him Seaman, 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 and he was kind of an interesting addition too. He had to be a little careful because a lot of the Indian tribes would eat dogs to
Oh, wow.
supplement their diet. So there was one time that Seaman was stolen by a tribe out around the Washington, Oregon area, out in there near the West Coast, and Lewis had to send 3 men after these Indians that took Seaman, and he made no bones about it. You know, you give that dog back or else. You know, and of course they immediately handed him over. But Seaman actually ended up returning a favor to Lewis. Lewis had to sew him up and save him from bleeding from death because a wounded beaver got a hold of Seaman and really bit him pretty badly. So Lewis fixed him up, and a couple of weeks later, Seaman returned the favor because a huge bull buffalo came across the river, stomped into one of the canoes, which they called pirogues, stomped into one of these canoes and did a lot of damage in the canoe, and then started running through the camp, and he was headed right for Lewis and Clark's tent. And Seaman, when he saw that happening, he kind of ran over, got in between, started barking, and the buffalo turned off, because otherwise that buffalo might have run right through their tent and killed one of them, you know.
Oh,
So a lot of interesting things that happened along the way, and that's what I would put in that program, you know, to tell kids. If is it all right if I share 1 or 2 more real quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. They had along a Frenchman named Pierre Cruzattee, and Cruzattee was their cook. He was like the camp cook, and he could play the fiddle pretty well. So at night, when they'd be sitting around the fire and all pretty tired and things like that, he'd play the fiddle, and sometimes they'd sing. Sometimes they'd even have enough energy to dance a little bit and have some fun. But Pierre Cruzattee had a problem. He couldn't see very well. He was nearsighted, very nearsighted. He could see things right in front of him, but distance was a real problem, and he didn't have glasses. So at one point, and they had found that grizzly bears were pretty tough to kill when they finally ran into grizzly bears. And at one point they were out hunting for buffalo, and Cruzattee mistook a grizzly bear for a buffalo. And he shot the darn thing, and luckily he escaped with his life, because one bullet in a grizzly bear wasn't going to do it. And he got chased by the grizzly, but luckily he got back and made it. Well, unfortunately, on the way back from the West Coast, which is they're gone like almost 2.5 years basically, but they're on the way back now. And at this point, all their clothing is worn out. So what they're wearing is pretty much buckskins. You know, they're wearing clothing that they made either from elk or deer or whatever, antelope, whatever. And they would use these hides to make their clothing. So they're out hunting. And why in God's name they gave Pierre Cruzattee a rifle, I have no idea, with his eyesight, you know. But Lewis is along the banks of the river in the willows, and they're hunting for elk. And Cruzattee ends up shooting Lewis in the butt. He thought Lewis was an elk. He sees him going through the willows there, and he shoots at him. Well, luckily for Lewis, it hit him in the buttocks, and it wasn't a very serious injury. However, Lewis could not sit down in the kayak, or in the canoe, all the way back to St. Louis. He had to kneel the whole way back because of the injury there. So there was a lot of really weird things that happened. And one of the best ones is there was a guy named Hugh McNeil who was part of the group. But when they left, by the way, when they left from Fort Mandan, which was in North Dakota. That's where they stayed the first winter. They sent some of the men back to St. Louis with some of the things that they had collected. By the way, they discovered something like 178 new plants and 122 new animals that were unknown to science at that point. So
Oh
this
wow.
was quite an expedition, you know. Anyway, they left Fort Mandan with only 31 people plus Sacagawea and her baby, who was known, his name was actually Jean Baptiste, but he was known as Little Pomp. Uh, and then also with Seaman, the dog. Okay, that's where they left from there. Anyway, they're coming back now. They're on the way out. They decided to cache or dig a hole and put in some of their supplies and bury them so that on the way back they'd be able to dig them up and have them. They didn't have to take all these things with them. They didn't need all of it. And on the way back, they sent Hugh McNeil out to find the cache, okay, so they could dig it back up. And as he's going out on horseback, and he's getting pretty far from camp at this point, searching for this spot, a big grizzly came out of the willows, scared the daylights out of his horse. His horse reared up. McNeil fell off. And when the horse threw him, he kind of landed right near where the big grizzly was. And this big grizzly reared up. And McNeil, fortunately, his rifle landed right next to him. He grabbed the barrel of his rifle, okay, and he stood up quickly, and he swung and whacked the grizzly right on top of the head with the wooden stock. Well, it broke the stock off of the gun, but it stunned the grizzly just enough, believe it or not, for him to be able to run over and climb a tree. And he was stuck there for like 3 hours. That's what he estimated the time to be before that grizzly finally gave up and wandered off. And then he had to go and find his horse, which had wandered off about a half a mile after this whole incident. So again, a lot of neat things happened. It's the best part of history, really, when you think about it,
Yeah,
when you
absolutely.
find out about all these kind of cool things, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just really got interested in this. Two more things I should share with you real quickly. Twice, women saved the day for the expedition. Okay. The first time, if you remember, I said that Sacagawea, which means bird woman, was stolen when she was about 8 years old. Okay. So now she's 16, has this baby, and they're back in the area where the Shoshones are. And by the way, what they were looking for was the Northwest Passage. Okay. Well, there was no such thing as a Northwest Passage. And they of course, figured that out finally. They realized they were going to need horses to get through the Bitterroot Mountains and so forth. And they needed to be able to trade with the Shoshones for these horses. They weren't sure the Shoshones were going to be willing to do it. But while they're talking to Cameawait, who was the chief of the Shoshone tribe that they had met up with, all of a sudden, Sacagawea looks up and realizes, oh my gosh, there's my brother. Here, Cameawait was her brother. And because of the fact that it was her brother, he was willing to trade for all the horses that they would need. So that's the first time a woman saved the day for the expedition. And then the next time was after going through the Bitterroots, they were pretty much all nearly starved. They couldn't find game throughout the Bitterroot Mountains. One time they did find a couple of deer, and their guns were the powder was so wet that they couldn't even fire. So they were really hurting for food. And they finally came upon the Nez Perce Indians, and the Nez Perce fed them. Unfortunately, what the Nez Perce fed them was a lot of spoiled fish, dried fish, which was kind of spoiled, and also camas roots, which, I don't know, like we eat carrots and potatoes and things like that. Well, these Indians ate these camas roots. Camas is a plant, and they didn't agree very much with these men's stomachs. And they also ate too much. They were really hungry and they ate too much. They got flat on their backs, sick. I mean, they could not move. And the Nez Perce men said, oh my gosh, all we have to do is kill these. They can't put up any resistance. All we have to do is kill them. We'll have all these guns, all this ammunition, all these supplies, all these horses, we're going to kill them. And there was an old woman named Watkowis who had been stolen when she was a little girl. by another Indian tribe, and she had ended up somewhere in Canada. And there were white people who discovered what had happened to her, and they helped her get back to the Nez Perce tribe. And when she heard they were planning to kill them, Watkawis went up to the tribal leaders and she said, wait a minute, these guys are white people. They're the kind of people who helped me. Please do know them, or do them no harm, I think were the words that she kind of used. So she saved the day. So
Wow.
for the second time, a woman actually saved their butts. And then one more thing that I'll share with you before we go on to something else is something pretty historic happened when they got to the Pacific Ocean. They had to find a place to stay for that second winter. And Lewis and Clark said, okay, we don't know whether we're going to stay on the south side of the Columbia or the north side of the Columbia River. There were good points and bad points to both. So they were arguing it out, and they finally said, okay, we're going to put it to a vote, and we are going to give everybody in the party an equal vote. So for the first time in United States history, a woman and a black man were given an equal vote, which is kind of interesting when you think about that.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Yeah, that it
Yeah.
started, I guess, so 1808 or 1809, around that era.
That
Around that time.
would have been 1805. It would have
Oh
been
wow.
in the fall of 1805, because they stayed 1805, 1806 at Fort Clatsop, which was on the Oregon side, actually the south side of the river. And they had a really tough time of it there. They had only 12 days the entire winter without rain. The West Coast can be pretty wet, when you're so close to the ocean there, and they actually had only 12 days in the several months that they were there where it didn't rain. It actually, the buckskin clothing that they had made, a lot of it ended up rotting. They couldn't get it to dry out, because of all the rain. So anyway, pretty cool trip. We got to meet a lot of neat people. I got to see my cousin's place for the first time. And I got to spend some really good time with my dad too, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and you get to learn so much out there and kind of see how the country was not founded, but I guess kind of founded, just the way that things progressed after it was founded, just to be able to see how, I guess, it was how difficult it was just to kind of get from being just coming over here on boats and then to actually having a civilization that you could live in.
Yeah, well, yeah, and when they went out there, they really had no idea what they were going to find. There were actually rumors at that time that they would find woolly mammoths when they went out there. Okay, of course, there were no woolly mammoths around anymore, but it seems that at one time there probably was. If you follow some of the ancient Indian stories and things, there were probably woolly mammoths in the area, and I think they have found some remains of them out west. And the other thing they were told, which of course wasn't true, they said there were 18-inch high Indians or devils of some kind, not Indians, but these 18-inch high people, which would shoot you with poison arrows at a place called Spirit Mound in the Dakotas. Well, of course, they found out that that wasn't the case, but they had no idea what they were going to find. It was almost like going to the moon would be today.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's just interesting to kind of hear how, because we take so much for granted about what we can see with satellite and everything. You can see pretty much everything out there, but then back then
Oh yeah.
there was nothing. You don't know what's going to happen. You just you can only reference from what's around you, and your imagination can come up with whatever else is out there in the wilderness that you don't know. But yeah.
Yeah, and there are still areas out west that are pretty remote.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, yeah, it's different. When I love going out west, I really do, and it's really different out there. When they came back, believe it or not, when they came back to St. Louis, many of the people believed that they had all died.
Yeah. Wow.
And interestingly enough, because they had no way to communicate after that first winter when they sent some men back, after that point, nobody knew where they were, what they were doing, whether they were, had survived or whatever. They actually lost only one man on the entire trip. And that was on the way up the Missouri. He ended up getting really sick. His name was no wait, Sergeant Floyd. I can't think of his first name right now, but Sergeant Floyd got really sick, and to the best of what they can figure today, they think he probably ended up with appendicitis. And of course, back in those days, even if he would have been in a city and had gotten sick like that, they didn't know how to treat appendicitis at that time, you know.
Wow.
So they figured that's what killed him. And out of all those people, to only lose one is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's really something to think about just for the era that it was. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing. So I think I talked a little bit about uh I'm not out west a little bit. So I know you did some full-time RVing, so maybe we can jump to that a little bit, talk about maybe some of the experiences you've had out doing that.
Sure, absolutely. Um, we've always been a camping family, okay? And from the time that my kids were born, we started out in a tent. We ended up with a pop-up eventually, and then had that for a very long time. That was the affordable way to be able to go places. We actually did a trip out west with the pop-up at one time when the kids were fairly young. Um, so anyway, camping was always something that was in our blood. And then when I retired from teaching in 2009, I had said I want to do a retirement trip out west, and go out for a couple weeks with a camper and get to see some national parks and things like that. And my wife was getting a little frustrated with her job at that point, and she had gotten permission to take 3 weeks off so we could do this trip, you know. And we were kayaking on the Oxbow Bend of the Snake River, and all of a sudden she turned, and it was beautiful. I mean, there were white pelicans swimming around us. The Teton Mountains still had snow on the peaks, you know, and that kind of thing. It was actually before Memorial Day at that time when we were out there. Uh, and she turned her kayak around and she said, That's it. We're going to go home. We're going to sell our house and we're going full time RVing." And I said, "You're crazy." And then about 30 seconds later, I said to her, "You know what? That's not such a bad idea." so so she said, I just want to quit my job. And we figured it out at that time. Healthcare wasn't terribly expensive. It was something we could afford to do. So we ended up selling our house and buying a truck that was big enough and a camper that was big enough to do the full timing. And that's kind of how that all started.
Yeah, that's awesome. I I think some people when they think about doing that, it's so daunting and they can't kind of wrap their head around it. But it seems like if you prepare and you kind of think about all the things that could come up or the costs that you need, you can kind of have a visual of what you need to have taken care of before you can start that. Whereas like it seems like people will see that and think I can't be that can't be done. I couldn't quit my job and do something that like uh, incredible.
Yeah, you have to plan a little bit, and you don't want to jump into something without some experience. I mean, there's people who will all of a sudden they decide they're going to buy a camper and go full timing, and they've never camped.
Yeah.
I can't imagine doing that.
Oh yeah.
We at least had some experience, and knew what we were getting into, so to speak. So that helped a whole lot. But being a full timer was very liberating. Okay. Selling your house is kind of a big step, because now what you have to do is be able to get rid of a lot of stuff. And what you find out is that you can do without a lot of things that you thought you needed to have.
Right.
You just learn to do without certain things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so that it was kind of liberating in some ways, being able to do this. And the way we did it, of course, there's so many ways that you can go about doing it. If you have the money, which we didn't have a lot of money. I was still young, and neither of us were on Social Security at that point, so we had to do it just on my retirement income. So that was a little bit tough. But what you learn is, when you're camping, if you stay at a place for a length of time, it's a lot cheaper.
Right.
Like if you spend a month at one spot, I'm just going to throw out this as a figure. It may cost you $800 to stay there for the month. Okay. But if you stay for 2 or 3 nights and then move on and keep doing that throughout the entire month, 2 or 3 nights at a place might cost you about $250 nowadays.
Oh wow.
So,
Yeah.
so you do that 10 times, all of a sudden you're spending $2 or $3,000 at least in a month by just moving on from place to place like that. So we found if we stayed someplace for a period of time, it was a lot cheaper. We would end up, our oldest son lived in Miami, or still does actually. But we would go to the Miami area, stay at a campground called Miami Everglades, and we'd stay there for 4 months, December 1st to April 1st. And then we would head back home, stop somewhere along the way, see something that we hadn't really experienced before, come back here, stay for about 6 weeks in this area, and then we would go to Maine and spend 5 months there, the middle of May till the middle of October. And when we did that the first year, the people that owned the campground, it was a small private campground, they said, well, you're coming back next year. How about you work for us? So it worked out really nice. My wife and I both worked at the campground a little bit. They gave us a really good deal on our, camping there, and that was a real good deal. And we ended up loving. This was Acadia National Park where we were at, and we just ended up loving it up there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Especially thinking about, like, we did talk about planning ahead, but just now that you kind of know that, oh, I can't just it's more cost effective to stay somewhere for longer than it is to just kind of go to a place a couple of days. And I know there's some places
Yeah.
out west too that are even like public lands where you can I think you can stay for like 30 days without
Yes.
getting,
Yeah.
but
I
it depends where
actually,
you are.
yeah, I'm not sure that I've seen too many that'll allow you 30 days. Although that could be in some places. I know there's a lot of places like state parks and things. They'll have a 14-day limit.
Right.
Okay, and the way some people will get around that, you can stay 14 days at one site, and then you have to leave for a day, and then you can come back and stay another 14 days or whatever. Of course, that's a pain in the neck to have to move all your equipment and then come back again and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
anyway, yeah, there's ways around some of that, I guess.
Absolutely. Is there maybe one or two stories from that trip that would be, but maybe were the most memorable?
Well, we did this for over 4 years. Okay, so we certainly had 4 years worth of stories that we could tell. But I guess in general, the one thing I would want to share with you is we met so many wonderful people doing this. It's unbelievable. I mean, we met people like Paul Mason from Maine. Paul flew he was probably about 89 or something like that when we first met him. He flew the last mission. He was a bomber pilot. He flew the last mission in World War II over Tokyo.
Wow.
What an interesting guy. And we would see him down in Florida every winter. And then when we'd be up in Maine, we were only about an hour away from where he lived. And we would go and take him out for breakfast. And he just was a great guy to get to know. And then we got to know Gary and Anita from Michigan, and Chris from Michigan. And then trying to think of some of the other people. Don and Randy from Maine became probably our best friends while we were full timing. And then the interesting thing that happened was we had no idea, but here we are from Lehighton, and we get down there to this campground in Miami, and we go to see a movie. They had movie night on a Wednesday night, and we sit down, and this lady who sat down beside us introduces herself. And she said something about her son. And I said, Schmitty's your son? And she just said, how do you know him? I said, well, he played baseball with my son. He was at my house plenty of times, and my kid was at yours. Here they were from Jim Thorpe.
Oh,
They
wow.
only lived about 5 miles away. And here we got to meet them in Miami, Florida, of all places. But we really got to meet a lot of neat people. That was really cool. The other thing was I had a Siberian. We had a Siberian Husky who was really a beautiful looking dog, and through him, we would get to meet people. Oh my gosh, everybody loved this dog. They'd be coming up taking pictures of him, and he and I hiked. There's 114 miles of trails in Acadia National Park. He and I basically hiked all of them. I hiked all of them. He could not hike the ones where there were ladders. There was a couple trails with ladders, so those are the ones that he couldn't make it on. But anyway, we had a lot of places. We kayaked, interesting places. We kayaked right past alligators in Florida. At first, I thought, oh man, I don't know if we can be kayaking with all these alligators around. Turned out that time of year in the winter, they aren't really very active. So you could kind of paddle right past them and they kind of pay you no mind for the most part. So anyway, lot of interesting experiences.
Yeah, that's cool. Just to kind of, like we've been talking about, you just get to experience different people and different kind of cultures and the way, people live in different areas of the country, and just kind of you learn like those small things, like, oh, I can kayak near alligators in the winter versus you couldn't do it in the summer. It's like you wouldn't know that just living in Pennsylvania or something, or
No,
if you lived in Ohio. It's
no.
like, yeah.
You know what else too? When you grow up in a small town like I did, Lehighton's really a small town. We really didn't have, at the time I went to school here, we really didn't have people of other cultures in the school. And then you go to a place like Miami where there are just people of all kinds of cultures and everything, and you begin to realize that we're all pretty much the same.
Yes.
We all want pretty much the same things, and it's really good to be able to experience that, you know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I kind of have that same uh where I live too. Is like, that's my grandparents and parents that kind of grew up in this area, and my grandfather worked at like the steel company, and
Oh
that was
yeah,
kind of like their sphere of living. It was just kind of this Lehigh Valley, maybe like 25
that's
30
right.
mile
Yeah,
radius, and they kind of all lived in that. And I think with me and some the people sort of my generation are kind of like, we want to get out and see, all these what's out past our the little towns we grew up in, and kind of you
for
can,
sure.
yeah.
And,
So
and
it's,
it's good for you.
yeah,
It's really
definitely.
good for you. It certainly is. One other thing I should share with you that turned out to be kind of interesting. I really um, became interested in doing a lot of photography. And when you're full timing, you get a lot of opportunities to do that, and especially in the Everglades. Oh my gosh, I'd get tremendous pictures of things, and up in Maine as well. But it was interesting. I started sending out little albums on my email to friends, and other people started finding out about the fact that I was doing this, and my list probably grew from an original list of about 15 people that I would send these to probably, and I think your mom was one of the people that was on the list eventually, but I probably was sending these out to over 100 people easily. Each time I would put together a little photo album, and let people know what we were doing. So that was kind of fun too.
Yeah, that's cool. I think sometimes you do that kind of stuff and you just expect to be the people who who are interested, and then it's like, oh, I mean, everybody, people who aren't doing that stuff, they're the ones who are like, oh, I'd love to see about that stuff and learn what other people are doing. Like, I'd love to, you get to see pictures and stories, and because a lot of people don't take the leap to do that kind of activities.
Well, you know what? And some people just they can't do it really when you
Right.
get
Yeah.
right down to it. Their lifestyle at that point, they have to work, they to do whatever. I had some people who would say to me, "Gee, we love this. Keep sending them. It's the only way we get to see some of this stuff."
Yeah.
So
That's interesting
so it's
too.
pretty cool.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think maybe we can talk about the Corpse of Discovery. So I guess it's a journal that are with stories in it that I'll let you
Well,
tell it.
yeah, the core of Discovery was basically the group of men that Lewis and Clark put together. Okay, and then what I ended up doing after learning all about the Core Discovery, and I told you a little bit about some of the members of the Core Discovery, like Pierre Cruzattee, who was blind in one eye and couldn't see very well out of the other, and all that kind of thing. I told you about those different people there. Anyway, after we did this trip, I put together 2 albums total of it. See, Lewis and Clark, as well as other members of the Corps of Discovery, which was basically their troop, if you want to call them that, they were all trained militarily, basically. Okay. But Lewis and Clark and many of the members kept journals. And some of them would write just about every night. So I kept the journal while we were on the trip, and I really put together a really nice keepsake. And what I did was I included pictures that I had taken along the way, and I would write up in 2 different formats. I would write up my journal. I typed it up and write in my journal for that day, everything that we had done. And then next to it, I wrote up all the events that had taken place. When I say all the events, the noteworthy events that I had gotten from the journals of Lewis and Clark. So if we traveled from point A to point B on this particular day, I'd write my journal notes up and type them in there, put them in there, and then I would take the events that happened with Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery in that same area.
Right.
Okay. And put down the date that it happened and what it was. And it was kind of neat the way it turned out. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's cool. Just kind of that juxtaposition, I guess, of what you did and what the stuff that they did.
And what had gone on. Yep.
Yeah,
What had gone on that was of interest, in the area that we covered today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So I guess maybe could with all the things that you've done and all these sort of stories you have, maybe if you have any advice for people who are kind of looking to do this kind of I guess lifestyle or just do these sorts of adventures, because I think people, we talked about it a little bit before, I know there's some people who can't do it, but there's other people who want to do it. They just need that little push to kind of get out there
Right.
and make it happen.
Well, I think there's 3 words that come to mind. To some extent, the Nike words, just do it, come to mind, because it's so easy to find all kinds of reasons that you can't do it. And sometimes if you don't just do it, it's not going to happen. Now it's easy to say that. Okay. But making it happen is another thing. Obviously you have to be able to, calculate what it's going to cost you and see whether it's something that is doable for you financially, because it may not be. You may have to scale it down or whatever the case may be. But plan. I mean, you have to plan. And if you want to do some kind of a trip related to some kind of events or whatever, like I did with Lewis and Clark, read up and find out about things, and not only about what happened, but read up about what's there now. I mean, we went to so many different museums and things along the way, and increased our knowledge of what happened with the Corps of Discovery by going to those places. So you have to prepare a little bit, and if it's something like camping, again, if you've never camped, don't try to do something big right away. Try to do something little first, see if it's for you, and then if it is, hey, like I said, just do it. It's life is too short. Sometimes you just have to say, hey, this is something I want to do, we're going to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's definitely a good message for people to kind of, they can get a little caught up in their head and saying, oh, I can't do it, but you just have to do it sometimes. Just go out and experience things, and you want to have a good life to kind of live and look back on and reflect on, I think.